Bueno, muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Algunos de ustedes muy temprano, por la diferencia horaria aquí con Buenos Aires, con Argentina. Así que nuevamente muy buenos días. Vamos a dar comienzo a nuestra quinta clase de este curso profundizado sobre los desafíos de la salud global, una perspectiva parlamentaria, coorganizado por UNITE, la red de parlamentarios para la salud global, que la verdad que no me canso de decir que está haciendo un trabajo extraordinario, y nosotros la Escuela de Política, Gobierno y Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad Austral. Hoy tenemos una clase muy interesante acerca de la seguridad sanitaria mundial y el multilateralismo, que va a tener una especial referencia al COVID-19, así que es una clase imperdible. Tenemos dos expositores, dos profesores de renombre, Annabelle Botea, que es francesa, y Andrew Ullmann, alemán, parlamentario alemán, que los va a presentar Ana Kushnir, que está aquí, y que entre ambos coordinamos este curso, yo por UNITE y ella, yo por el CIDEIPP, por la Escuela de Gobierno de la Universidad Austral, y ella por UNITE. Así que, bueno, muchísimas gracias. Mientras hacía esta introducción, esperaba que ingresaran sus compañeros. Así que, si te parece, Ana, haces la presentación de ambos profesores y también algún comentario adicional que tenés para hacerles. Gracias.
Bien, perfecto. Comienzo al revés por el comentario adicional. Gracias, Juan, por darme la palabra, y gracias a la Austral de nuevo por ser anfitriones nuestros en este curso. En algún sentido estamos en el Zoom de la Austral, en la casa de la Austral, así que gracias por alojarnos. Primero quería empezar por ese comentario adicional, que es que me fueron llegando de varias de ustedes, preguntas sobre el trabajo final. Si van al programa, en la página 21, justamente hay una referencia al trabajo final, les leo y después comento una cosita. Ahí dice que los alumnos y alumnas deben concluir el curso con una reflexión final acerca de las problemáticas políticas, sociales y económicamente relevantes asociadas a la salud global, desde una perspectiva parlamentaria. Entonces, el trabajo final, para decirlo de un modo un poco más oral, es que ustedes puedan escribir una reflexión final sobre algunos de los temas vistos en el curso. Puede ser la combinación entre dos temas, puede ser una discusión o unas preguntas sobre un tema. No es un trabajo muy formal en ese sentido, sino que pedimos que ustedes puedan elaborar una breve reflexión final escrita. Y después mandamos bien el modo para hacerlo, digamos, como una plantilla, tipo de letra, de tipografía, esas cuestiones, pero la idea es tener unos 2 meses, entre mes y medio y 2 meses para entregarlo. Así que después mandamos fecha y todas las formalidades. Pero no es nada muy complejo, digamos. Es poder tener algún feedback de parte de ustedes. Bueno, eso respecto del trabajo final. Cualquier cosa, cuando termine esta clase, nos pueden hacer preguntas que les hayan quedado. Veo acá a los dos expositores de hoy, así que aprovecho para saludar al doctor Andrew Ullmann, que se está conectando desde Berlín, Alemania, y a Annabelle Botea, de Francia, pero que se está conectando desde Lisboa. Hoy tenemos 2 profes extranjeros, una clase linda y desafiante. Van a tener durante toda la clase interpretación del inglés al español. Los 2 profesores van a hablar en inglés. No sé, Yasmín, si querés compartir la placa por las dudas para que todos ya se queden desde ahora en el canal español, quienes no hablan inglés o prefieren escuchar toda la presentación en español. ¿Tenés por ahí, Yasmín, la placa? Bien. Seguro muchos de ustedes ya saben, pero en Zoom hay una función para ir al idioma que ustedes necesitan estar para escuchar siempre en ese idioma. Entonces van a interpretación y eligen español. Dejamos un segundito la placa. Bueno, bienvenido, Andrew, y encantada de tenerlo aquí en UNITE y en Austral, en este curso profundizado sobre salud global que estamos haciendo desde una perspectiva parlamentaria, y justamente hoy la idea es poder nutrirnos a partir de su clase sobre esa perspectiva parlamentaria respecto de los temas que nos preocupan en salud global. Para quienes no lo conocen, Andrew Ullmann cumple actualmente su 2º mandato como miembro electo del Parlamento Federal alemán. médico de formación, Ullmann es miembro de la Comisión de Salud y se desempeña como portavoz de salud del grupo parlamentario del Partido Democrático Libre, el FDP. Ullmann también es presidente del Subcomité de Salud Global del Parlamento Federal Alemán y presidente regional para Europa Occidental y Central de nuestra red, de la red Unite. Ullmann se formó como especialista en enfermedades infecciosas en la Harvard Medical School, así como se formó también en hematología y oncología en la Universidad de Mainz. Es profesor titular de enfermedades infecciosas de la Universidad Julius Maximilian de Würzburg, Alemania, donde también fue elegido para el Consejo Municipal. Por otra parte, en la segunda parte de la clase vamos a tener a Annabelle Botea, como les contaba, de Francia, pero residiendo actualmente en Lisboa y trabajando para Unite. Annabelle tiene una maestría en Derecho Económico con especialización en Estudios de Gobernanza Global de la Facultad de Ciencias de Derecho de Sciences Po de París. Tiene experiencia en escenarios internacionales, trabajó como asesora en el Parlamento rumano en Bucarest y como consultora en políticas públicas en París. Actualmente trabaja en Unite como agente de políticas, es nuestra policy officer, digamos. Ella es la que está a cargo de seguir las negociaciones en torno al futuro tratado o acuerdo de las pandemias. Vieron que se llamaba tratado, ahora se llama acuerdo. Así como también seguir negociaciones y cuestiones en otras áreas relevantes de políticas de salud global. Sí, Annabelle es quien sigue y nos cuenta las cuestiones relacionadas con reuniones de alto nivel, Asamblea General de la ONU, ella es la que hace ese seguimiento. Bueno, así que estos son nuestros profesores hoy, y a menos que alguien tenga alguna duda, si le parece, Andrew, empezaríamos, lo dejo a cargo de la clase. Muchas gracias por estar.
Buenos días.
Buen día.
Buenos días.
Yeah.
Buen día, Andrew.
Desfundamente no puedo hablar español y luego continuar en inglés.
Claro que sí. Yes, you can.
Okay.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, and my apologies for coming in late. I was sitting in the Ministry of Health just a few minutes ago. We have a major reform bill upcoming for our hospitals in Germany, and I'm the spokesperson of my party, and therefore it was essential that I was participating in that meeting, and there's a lot of things still to go. Nevertheless, I think we have a different topic for today, and I heard a little bit Spanish, but my Spanish is, again, very limited, despite the fact I grew up in Southern California with a lot of Mexican friends, but didn't pick up so much. So I had my troubles learning German when I was moved to Germany by my parents. So let me just check the screen if I could share, and it is shareable. Okay, I got it. And let's see if this is going to work. Should be looking fine. Let me go in presentation mode, and then we could all start. Okay, do you see the screen properly? I think it looks good on my side.
Sí, la
Okay.
vemos, y Andrew, para chequear, está seteado en el canal de inglés, ¿no? Para poder escuchar si los alumnos hacen preguntas, para que poder escuchar la interpretación.
Okay, I was told that I'm being translated simultaneously. I hope this is going to work. Just a confirmation with a thumbs up if it's translated. Okay, I see a nodding, so that I'm fine. So today we wanted to talk a little about the global health security and multilateralism, and what our experience was the last couple of years. We were facing a lot of issues, especially in regards to COVID, and realizing that the global health security isn't working as we would expect. And the big question is, what is our role, my role as one of many parliamentarians, to work on a better relationship, multilateralism between the states, and how to get more security in regards to health. And therefore, I divided my talk into 3 parts. Introduction that might be a little bit on the long side, but I think it's important to pick up on all those informations to understand the background, what is happening, and looking specifically at the COVID-19 pandemic, where a lot of things were done correctly, but many things were done incorrectly. A lot of issues around that and how to improve for the future. And this automatically goes into the third part of the role of us parliamentarians in the future. What do we want to do in regards to the pandemic accord or the international health regulations? I think that is very much important. The world at itself is always at risk for the development of a regional and problems that could occur, especially on epidemics or pandemics, but it's also could tackle with the social stability and the economic stabilities of every country. There is no country that is outside of these rules, and this was very particular presented at the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board in the year 2019, and they were right. We were not prepared for the pandemic that was occurring. Here is a picture which I like to share, which you see the reference on the bottom, looking at examples of emerging and re-emerging diseases. Many of them look very common. Some are less common depending where you live in this world. Influenza, I think, is the most common virus worldwide. But if you look in Southern America or North America, by the way, even in Europe, hantavirus as an example, which is causing a lot of morbidity. If you look at other respiratory diseases, the issues about monkeypox were just recently realized, or even Rift Valley fever, just mentioning a few, and old epidemics or pandemics are still there. Malaria in those areas, and with global warming, I wouldn't be surprised if we would have soon issues here in Europe with malaria, where we're not prepared for, or even looking at other areas like cholera. The question really is, what about vaccine, and how do we take care of that? But one pandemic was really concerning for me as a person who was working a lot in infectious diseases, is the silent pandemic of multi-drug resistant bacteria or fungi that's out there. Fungi are always neglected, but for example, Candida aureus is one of those emerging new fungal pathogens, which is causing a lot of havoc in the area of intensive medicine. And the question arises, what are the costs? What does it really mean in a given pandemic or epidemic? What are the costs worldwide? And the question is it more smarter to invest beforehand to prevent or keep disease levels low, the morbidity or the mortality, of course, as well, rates, keep them low, because then it is money saved if you invest on a regular basis. Here you see interesting figures in regards to various viruses. You see that, let's point out SARS and MERS, the costs that were pretty much on the low side, especially MERS. However, if we would have a picture of SARS-CoV-2, it wouldn't fit here on the board. Probably would hit my ceiling here in my room. The amount of billions of US dollars spent here, which can also put in any kind of currency, of course. The world at risk is the question, and basically leadership was poor. Let me just, yes, oh, there it is. Just want to see there was something missing here. the leadership was poor in many countries. In my own country, I could say there were always different mixed messages sent by the government, by science, by local governments or state communities. Europe, we were not really speaking with one voice. The implementation, by the way, of the international health regulations was a major cause of this disease, to be honest. I was personally really upset about the government of China not providing the appropriate information to the world. I remember when I gave my speech in the German Bundestag, where a lot of people said, well, you cannot be so hard on China. And I said, well, you have to speak out the truth. And I do hope, and we'll get to this a little bit later, the lessons learned of this pandemic. What does it really mean? Personally, I wouldn't be too aggravated with the WHO calling the health emergency on a later time. I personally, and I'm a full professor for infectious diseases, I was expecting that the epidemics of China would probably take the same route as SARS-1. So at the beginning, I remember in December when I first got the first figures, I wasn't too concerned on a scientific basis, but you have to change your mind if there's new data coming in. And after the contagiousness of SARS-CoV-2, things should have been changed. There was, again, no adequate international support for preparedness in the poorest countries and fundings. I would say basically every country, but especially in the low-income countries, there was nothing. In other countries, there was something, but not really much. And what we did understand is the importance of research and development and the networking of the medical communities. I think that is really important. It was really lucky that a vaccine was developed. I think that was pure luck, especially with the mRNA-based vaccines. It was not especially expected that they would be successful because there was a lot of research done in the past 20 years, but they found a stability. So there we got lucky. But what about epidemiology? What about correct data of disease burden in a given country? And what about infection prevention measures? There were a lot of erratic things going on, and there were a lot of guesses instead of evidence-based. So that was a challenge, and therefore we really have to be aware what the future holds. So basically, we need adequate leaders to this regard. Therefore, each government, each national government must commit and invest into appropriate groups or organizations that are necessary. And they must lead by example, but the example means also lead by scientific evidence. And all countries must build their own systems. They're all responsible for their own systems. Nevertheless, networking remains a very important issue. This could be done on a continental basis and connecting as well. Multilateralism plays a fundamental role. I'm not convinced that bilateral agreements are that helpful. Therefore, we must prepare ourselves better. And it is important that it comes always with a price tag. And I think it's important, we'll speak about this as well, the WHO, to stabilize the WHO by financings, of course, and the commitment of countries financing this institution, but also other institutions are possible. But I understand for myself on political grounds that the WHO is the important umbrella organization that we have to have. And nevertheless, or not that nevertheless, funding is always helpful, especially in research and strengthening, especially areas where the situation or the infrastructures are not given yet. So that is the important part. The United Nations must strengthen coordination mechanisms. I see this especially in regards to the WHO. And that said, all leaders of all levels hold the key. And it's their responsibility to understand that preparedness is very important for not only their own society, but also all of society globally. And that ensures not only their citizens to be protected, but it protects all in the world better. It's not 100% protection, it will never be. That's how medicine is, but it needs to guarantee that everybody is involved. That we are all equal in this world. Now, if we take a look at what happened in the past, I hope you could see this on the right side of the scale, where you see the number of the deaths in correlation with the density of the population. And the question when I saw this for the first time was, well, SARS-CoV-2 was or is a very deadly virus, but I do question why Africa was protected the way it looks like in this figure. And when you look at this figure, I think it is more of the infrastructure. China had a low mortality rate. I wouldn't trust the data. And I think that especially African states, or if you look at India, Pakistan, for example, those rates are also very low. I think those countries do not have all capacities that are necessary to have an appropriate database to report what their situation in the world or in comparison is with the mortality rate of SARS-CoV-2. And just a small peek to Europe, which also underlines the political tensions that we have. You could see Belarus with a low mortality rate, which might be also politically driven. And that is a major problem when you look at data sharing between the countries, that they are sometimes politically driven, not showing the appropriate numbers, which is not honest, and it is not fair to their own people and to the people worldwide. You can see what other impact SARS-CoV-2 had, or the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see here that 1.6 billion students were out of school. The numbers of people pushed into poverty by the year 2030 due to lack of education, due to lack of jobs development, is over 250 million people. And on top of that, the emerging crisis of climate change, investment into clear energy was dropped by almost a third, which is concerning, especially in the industrial world, but also developing areas, countries with low and middle income. The investment strength in clean energy is low, or it was lower. So what were the key findings of the panel of pandemic preparedness and response? Despite the years of warning, and as I said before, in my lectures in university, I was always bringing up the example of the influenza of 1917, 1918 in Europe, Ebola outbreaks, which was not a real pandemic, and the issue of multi-drug resistant. We teachers in the university warned. We said we are not prepared, and it was even worse, in my opinion, than as it turned out to be. The international health regulations were too slow or not really implemented, and there were hardly any kinds of emergency procedures. We were, in Germany, I could say, we were just, there was a competition between parties, between politicians, what would be the better strength of regulations that we need for our country, showing that this politician is a strong person who proposes to be a leader, but they weren't leaders. And that caused a lot of question marks in our population, at least in Germany, and resulted into more extreme right and more extreme left voting in the last elections here for the German Bundestag. Especially the right were strengthened a lot more. Wait and see. That's the other way to go for it. That too little is as bad as too much. So there's an urgent demand to have a good setup, including, that was the issue here, I think elsewhere as well, protect the personal protection supplies, masks, gowns, etc. They were missing. We were, in my university, if we didn't have the delivery, I think somewhere it was in April, within the next 5 days, 2020 it was, we had no protection gear. We were out. And I remember the swine flu, I think that was like about 12 years ago or 15 years ago in the meantime. We had put up systems to have it, but they were neglected because nothing happened thereafter. There was no coordinated global leadership. The WHO was put into question on the one side, and the other side, WHO, the expectancy of a lot of people on the WHO was more than they could provide. So there were a lot of global tensions. Just remind you of border closing, no more flights, the shutdown on public transportation, the shutdown of a lot of working facilities for the people, which caused a lot of, let's say, economic issues as well as social issues as well. International financing. Let me remind you about who wanted to have the first vaccines, who wanted to buy the masks. This were the financial stronger countries. The low and middle income countries were neglected. And the WHO underpowered agency, I said already, and zero planning on the gaps in social protection. There was really nothing out there, at least not to my attention. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we could discuss this later in the discussion part. And as I mentioned briefly, what about protection gear? What about vaccines? Especially the figure on the left-hand side is really not devastating, might be the right word, but disappointing. Let's put it this way. It was the rich countries that profited from the vaccine campaigns. The others were neglected. It took a while. And on top of that, and now we have a lot of people, not everywhere in the world, it is in the higher and middle income as well as in the low or low income countries that are suspicious about vaccination. They put the vaccines into question. And that is a big issue. And you could see here that the high income countries, almost 3 out of 4 people were at least vaccinated with 1 dose. By the way, not clinical effective. You need a couple, at least 3 or maybe now 4 doses in the meantime. And the lower income companies, only 1/3 of the population. Far too low, but nevertheless, the last conversations that I had with some African colleagues is that the suspiciousness against vaccines is a big issue. And that underscores the fact that communication strategies were basically missing. And if you look at this here, this next slide, you could see here that the delay was very obvious. And now we have an oversupply now in 2023 on vaccines. We have enough vaccines, but this is almost 2 years later, 1.5 years later. So where do we go from here? How do we strengthen national, regional, or global capacities? And more importantly, how do we become resilient to future pandemics? First of all, I think it's very clear we need a higher, sustained, and long-term political engagement at the level of the world leaders of states and governments, and not strange ideas. Define clear processes and tasks. Enhance long-term public and private sector support at all levels. Foster integration of health matters across all relevant policy areas, health in all policies. It's just one keyword that you could remember. Foster global health equity that is important, especially in regards to SDGs that was already passed for a couple of years back, and to understand in the contents of pandemics that no one is safe until everyone in the world is safe. I think Dr. Tedros, the WHO director, is totally right. It sounds so easy on this slide with the bullet points, but it is obvious that there's a lot of work to be done if we want to follow all these bullet points. There's no question in my mind. There's an amendment to the international health regulations. It was created of the health regulation in May of 2021, and it is somewhat a prelude to the pandemic treaty that is on its way, and they're looking at 8 fields of special interest. I think it is too optimistic to say make it the last pandemic. I would say make it the last pandemic to this extent, because we will never be sure that there are pandemics arise, but I think there's a difference in how bad a pandemic could occur. So you could see it here in the reference was here. The source is the independent panel.org, where you could pull up this slide or this PDF. There are different areas. There is the call for immediate action to end COVID-19. Sounds nice, but this could be done for other pandemics as well. Elevate leadership for a global health system or architecture. Strengthen the umbrella institution of the WHO. Invest, this is well invested money in preparedness for future pandemics. Establish a new global surveillance system, because I don't know your neck of the woods, but here in Germany, when there was the weekend, all of a sudden our infection rates dropped, but there was a strange increase of infections on Mondays and Tuesdays. So you can make sense what happened in Germany. Is this surprisingly that our digitalization age didn't work as of yet, meaning that there was a lot of transcripts done on Excel spreadsheets, or even worse, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was fax to Berlin, the information of the different regions of the infection rate. Also, the establishment of a pre-negotiated platform for tools and supplies. We have those supplies. Act A is one of those examples, but this could be further advanced for future pandemics. A new international financing for global public goods, issue around equity in regards to protection gear or medication or vaccines, and especially the effective national coordination, and I would add international coordination. I think that is really important to have those 8 fields of importance really looked at. So there is agreement of many countries of the version of 2005. However, that's not enough. We are more countries. I forgot, I wanted to look up how many countries there is worldwide. All countries must, or should, in this case, report the events of international public health importance. But the COVID-19 really showed their weakness. And as I said before, and I don't want to reiterate it again and again, but it was China very reluctant to provide information. And I think that is something that has to, maybe with something with self-esteem of a country, I don't know what the psychology behind it is. However, it has to be understood that we cannot use or should not use health data as a weapon of mistrust or misinformation. Now, there's a lot of debate. I don't know about your country, but here in Germany, we have the debate because there's a small percentage of population here in Germany who got radicalized during the pandemic. There was a shift to the right. And there's always a big concern that Germany might lose its sovereignty due to a pandemic accord or treaty. And a lot of people do not understand the background. Maybe before we go to the the treaty itself or accord, it's important to note that the pandemic accord or treaty, whatever it's going to be called at the end, is the emergency situation when we have a pandemic. Before that, we need a strengthening of the international health regulations to understand what is going on, how data can be publicized and shared. And in the days of digitalization and advanced computerization, we have the big chance with so much data to go into data mining and digging to use artificial intelligence, maybe even to detect or provide a forecast of possible dangers in the time ahead. It's not an adequate comparison, but look at the worldwide weather forecasts. That is something very similar. A lot of data which is put together and analyzed, compared with previous data and additional data, maybe water, temperature, higher winds, lower winds, etc., put into a long-term forecast. And something like that, I envision for the data collections that we have. And we are lucky here in Germany, but this is not for Germany itself, it's for the global society. We have the WHO hub for pandemic, it's epidemic and pandemic intelligence, where all the information is put together and being analyzed. That said, why do we need a pandemic accord when it's important that we now have better information, faster information about pandemic threats. We need equitable access. That means everybody needs access to pandemic countermeasures, diagnostic procedures, diagnostic tests, medications, data, preliminary data and clinical studies, vaccines. The solutions are usually cost-effective, based on regional and global planning for stockpiling and production of pandemic supplies in or near a given country. One good example is the idea of protection gear that could be circling around hospitals or other private practices where you need it, so you keep it always fresh and up to date regards the hygiene regulations. Guarantee a seat at the table for all national leaders. I think that is important, that everybody who are responsible for pandemic preparedness response will be taken into account. That said, here in Germany, this is our political, not solution, but political resolution, the issue between China and Taiwan. We took sides and said Taiwan needs to have a seat at the WHO, the WHA, to exchange information and be prepared as well if something occurs. We need supply chains that work. Supply chains fell together, especially for us in Europe. I think at your place probably as well. A lot of protection gear we do receive from China or from the Asian continent. And all of a sudden, there were no supplies. And every country should be clear about their own core capacities. Research, as a person from research and science, I think it is really important to share the data and trust each other in regards to healthcare issues. It sounds, again, so easy, but we do know, try to get, for example, Ukraine and Russia on one table today and talk about health issues. They probably would not be willing to talk at all. They would probably talk about who is right or wrong. So that is always an issue. One Health, I think the zoonoses are the danger for the human health. We have to be very much aware of that. And again, I like to reiterate, networking, multilateralism are really the important issues here that we have to look at. So where do we want to go? We just had a couple of meetings. We just recently passed the 76th World Health Assembly. There should be a progress report coming out, or there is probably one already out there. I didn't have the time to read it yet, if it's there already. And there's going to be next year, the next World Health Assembly, and I'm really looking forward how we're moving forwards in regards to the pandemic accord and how do we progress with the international health regulations. So here, once again, I'll go on. I'm looking at the time. I didn't look at the time. We'll have to hurry up a little bit. Sorry. I didn't look at the time, so I will jump this because a lot of things were already explained here. The benefits are obvious. They are so obvious with the networking and the sharing of data, especially those lessons learned. I think it's all there. Improved equity, vaccines, medications, the agreement of multilateralism and legally binding agreement and sharing information, establishing principles, priorities, and targets, strengthening the national, regional, or global resilience to future pandemics, sharing monitoring data, genetic data, samples, technology associated with the benefits, and last but not least, because this is the threat that we're facing, the One Health approach. So what is the role? I'm coming to the last part of my talk. What is the role of us parliamentarians? First of all, let me say one thing. I'm a proud member of the Unite group of parliamentarians who faced the issues of fighting special infectious diseases. It was originally HIV, TB, malaria, but now we want to fight it on a global thinking. Global health is now one of our major issues with Unite. Whenever you meet a parliamentarian, try to invite him or her into this group. I think that is important. The more international we are, it is a grassroots organization, and I think that's very important. But you see here, there are delegates from all 194 member states of the WHO. They are part of the decision-making body of the WHO within the World Health Assembly. And there is a determination of the policies appointing the general director. There is a supervision of financial policies and review and improvement of proposed program budgets. So that is one issue. The parliamentarians consult and exchange with their citizens, give input in form of motions, suggest corrections, discuss in committees or subcommittees, as we do in Germany. We have a subcommittee on global health, and we control the global access to all the motions and proposal. And again, we are getting connected, for example, within Unite. I think it's important, especially in regard to the concerns of many people or many citizens in the countries, that this every proposal, any pandemic accord needs ratification by the parliaments in their given countries. It is nothing done automatically when a group of parliamentarians in the WHO come together at the WHA, and say, this is where we go. Every parliament has to react to it. That's why parliamentarians play a key role in strengthening the global health architecture in the areas of sustainable financing and developing and implementing the International Accord for Pandemic Preparedness, Prevention, and Response. I think it can only work in this trilogy together. And therefore, we have to understand that COVID-19 is not the last pandemic. We will, I think in human history, we'll never really tackle a pandemic, but we could downgrade a pandemic in its morbidity and mortality outcome. And therefore, the One Health approach and looking at zoonosis that can transmit disease from animals to humans is so important. And we have a very dense human population. We have globalization, a lot of connections with the flights, with the airplanes or with the ships. So we will never be 100% protected unless we live in a room for the rest of our lives without contact to the outside world, which is not possible, of course. This is an interesting picture, as I wanted to show you where the next pandemic may start. And it is also to understand that these are not only areas where there is zoonosis, but also traveling issues where you travel into a very dense population, immunologically naive population, and then you could really have outbreaks of severe diseases. It is understood that North America, especially Europe, India, and parts of China are very dense populated areas where a pandemic could flare up anytime and cause a lot of problems. So this kind of awareness that only One Health is an issue, looking at zoonosis in the animal world that could be contagious for the human world, but also understanding the globalization as it is in this century and how to be better prepared for the next pandemic and prevent, ideally, or mitigate a pandemic and work together on a better world. That since we do understand that health is a human right that we need to understand, and this can only be achieved if we do appreciate the issues of multilateralism in the global society, so that we could build up better after this pandemic a global health architecture. Thank you so much. Gracias for your attention.
Muchas gracias, profesor Juan. Seguro tiene alguna pregunta.
Sí, muchísimas gracias, y simplemente, si está de acuerdo el profesor, tal cual está puesto aquí en la placa, abrimos a preguntas, ¿no? Así que por favor levanten la mano con el... ahí tenemos a Edgar Jiménez. Por favor se presentan, de qué país provienen y hacen la pregunta. Gracias.
Muchas gracias al profesor. Mi nombre es Edgar Jiménez, soy de Paraguay. Quiero preguntar al profesor si, como parte de esa estrategia del futuro, considera factible que se trabaje en un proceso de transferencia de conocimientos y tecnologías para que en las diferentes regiones de la OMS haya posibilidad de desarrollar tecnología de alta complejidad, entre ellos vacunas, y por otra parte tecnologías de baja complejidad, pero que se debe producir a escala en situaciones de pandemia, puesto que en el modelo actual predomina la economía de escala en el concepto de eficiencia, en aquellas de baja tecnología, y en aquellas de alta tecnología están muy concentrados en algunos países de Europa y Estados Unidos y Japón, digamos, ¿verdad? Y en cambio, todo lo que sería el Ecuador, de la línea del Ecuador para abajo, el sur del mundo, dependemos de esa alta tecnología con, digamos, mucha desigualdad de acceso en momentos críticos. Cuando no hay momentos críticos, sí es posible acceder, pero en momentos críticos no. ¿Cree usted factible que esa pueda ser una línea de trabajo, aunque no sea lo más eficiente a corto plazo, podría ser una solución estratégica para el acceso a tecnologías complejas y no complejas? Muchas gracias y excelente presentación.
Thank you very much as well. I have to apologize because I turned on the translation a little bit late at the end, so I cannot understand a little bit, but not much. I didn't hear, it was more a comment than a question, as I understood it.
Puedo repetir muy sintéticamente.
Edgar, eso
le preguntaba
eso
al
te iba a
profesor
decir,
si
Edgar,
consideraba
resumí un poquitito.
que como parte de una nueva estrategia global para enfrentar una futura pandemia, es posible transferir conocimientos y transferir tecnologías para que las diferentes regiones de la OMS tengan capacidad de producir a alta escala tanto tecnologías de alta complejidad como de baja complejidad, porque entendemos que el modelo actual de suministros predomina la economía de escala. Entonces, dependemos de China. Y por otra parte, está la concentración en países europeos, Estados Unidos y Japón, de la alta tecnología para producir vacunas y otros productos biotecnológicos, que en momentos críticos es difícil de acceder en tiempo oportuno y con mucha desigualdad en el acceso. Entonces, le consulto si cree usted que es factible, entendiendo que hay intereses comerciales, económicos, de propiedad intelectual, y si cree que eso es factible, aunque no sea lo más eficiente a corto plazo. Muchas gracias, profesor.
Thank you very much. I got your question, and I think, yes, I think there are things could be done better, but to understand technology or high technology, it isn't easy within a couple of weeks or months or even years to build up a facility to upscale products. This was a big issue around mRNA. The technology is really very highly sensitive and is prone to failure. There were even batches thrown away because the stability of the vaccine couldn't be guaranteed, or the vaccine quality was bad. Nevertheless, I think that is really important for the global health architecture for the future. We need to cooperate with low and middle income countries with facilities. We need facilities that can upscale the production. I think that could be a win-win situation, especially when we combine patent and off-patent products together. This is not a simple chemistry recooking. It is a different facility if we're talking about vaccines. Again, a different facilities if we're talking about anti-infectives or other medications. So it is a very complex industry that we're talking about, which is not done with just putting up a building and then we're going to produce ourselves. And nevertheless, there are two things. I think access to products have to be faster. I think there's no question in my mind, and I think in a world as ours, we have to leave the nationalism behind. We experience it very sadly. Example, Europe. As I showed you this one slide, the application of vaccines were done quicker than in other countries. India, one of our main suppliers for Europe, said, wait a minute, we're going to produce first for our people, and then you get your medication. At the time of the pandemic, we had a President Trump in the US first, yeah, or America first, he said. And this kind of nationalism is hard to tackle. Nevertheless, these accords could help. Then we say we put quotas in. And also, I think the exchange of knowledge is very important. I do not agree on a political side that we give free intellectual property. I think this would destroy the incentives of research. And nevertheless, it is the responsibility of country leaders, if we want to do it better for the future, that we need to incentivize the sharing of intellectual property and the guarantee that those products that are then produced somewhere else have the same quality as in the original country. I think these are the major issues. It sounds so easy, give me a recipe. It's not a cooking recipe. It is very complex things that we're talking about. And that is, I think, one of the toughest discussions that we're facing in the pandemic accord.
Bien, señalo una cosita que me señalaba el profesor. Él va a tener que irse a otra reunión, entonces si hay alguna pregunta más puede contestar una pregunta breve, pero luego ya tiene que irse. Y bueno, como Annabelle Botea en la segunda parte de la clase va a estar también trabajando el tema del acuerdo de las pandemias, creo que también podemos, si hay más preguntas, dejárselas a ella. Marisa, adelante.
Gracias, profesor, por su excelente presentación. Hacía mucho que no escuchaba tanta precisión en el diagnóstico de la situación. Y claro, cuando vemos el sufrimiento generado por el COVID, cada muerte que tiene una biografía detrás, usted se refirió a la pérdida de empleos, al cierre de escuelas. Todos suscribimos esto. No puede volver a pasar en el mundo. La pregunta concreta entonces es, ¿cómo debemos preparar los equipos para las próximas pandemias? ¿Usted cree que la Organización Mundial de la Salud está en condiciones de hacerlo? Y en segundo lugar, ¿qué nuevo rol deben cumplir los parlamentarios en relación a estos temas? Muchísimas gracias nuevamente.
Thank you as well for this really excellent question, which is really not easy to answer, but I think we should discuss about this. First of all, how do we prepare ourselves on a practical basis for the next pandemic? I think that is a big issue because every pandemic will look differently. We're talking about a respiratory virus today. Tomorrow, we might be talking about a hemorrhagic virus, which is transported by blood, or it has to be a contact infection. Anything is possible. And therefore, we need some kind of scientific guidance. I would agree that the WHO at this point in time doesn't have the strength yet to bring out international guidance. They bring out some smaller parts of international or national guidance, but at this point, today at least, we have to rely on our own public health institutes, what kind of recommendations they put out. It's highly recommended, at least that's what I'm trying politically. That would also touch off on your question, what can a politician do, is force the not forgetting of the pandemic. Because at least my impression is that a lot of my political friends, even within my own party, to make it very clear, are very happy that the pandemic is basically over, and then they could go back to the everyday scheduling of politics that we're facing, and this is history. Not understanding that we're looking at the future as well, and this is going to happen again, and probably faster than we'd like it. Just let me remind you, monkeypox. Remember the scare that occurred? And there's a German word, it's called Angst, being afraid. And this is typical German, by the way. The Germans are very easily to be scared people. Maybe it's due to our history of my grandparents or my parents with the war experiences that they had. But there's always a panic when other diseases show up and say, are we prepared? Why didn't the government do anything? I think it is, at least for our constitution, when we have a division of power with the executive branch and the legislation branch, both have to cooperate together. And it is, I think, imperative that parliamentarians press their executive branch to bring up laws, bring up institutions that work. That is, the National Public Health Institutes, and cooperate with the Global International Health Institute, which is called the WHO. I could take one more quick question if it's okay by the chair.
Vamos a tomar la de Lorena Franco, que está allí. No sé si la querés repetir, Lorena, o la leemos, como vos quieras. Por favor, decí la voz, lee la voz.
Bueno, la pregunta pasaba porque vi tratados más modernos sobre medio ambiente, en donde se llegaron a consensos para relegar ese cuestionamiento sobre la soberanía nacional que tienen los países y poner principios comunes ante una problemática tan urgente como es generar un modelo de economía teniendo en cuenta el medio ambiente. O sea, son cuestiones que apremian lo mismo esto. Me parece que hay una cuestión moderna en cómo concebimos estos tratados y capaz es un camino que se puede tomar para este desafío. ¿Qué opinión tenían las principales potencias también sobre esto? Porque claramente en el Tratado de Medio Ambiente Estados Unidos es bastante resistente a esos temas. Imagino que también hay potencias que están en la misma situación.
Also, thank you for this important question, because this question also touches off on global health as well, because of the climate changes that we're facing and that we cannot neglect. Luckily, the US, at least, when you're talking about the Paris Accord, the US has shifted, luckily, with the new administration. The question is if this is going to be sustainable or not. This is a very important question. I think the US, I think the US has to have still some more convincing done, because what I hear, I think, from Congress is there's a big reluctance in regards to the pandemic accord. So there are a lot of negotiations. We're not at the end of the street yet. We still have to negotiate a lot, and this is the challenging part. Nobody said that politics is easy, and nobody said that multilateralism is easier than bilateralism. It is challenging, but I would say intellectually doable if there's the will on all sides. And the US, there are very smart people there, especially in regards to science and global health, hopefully can convince the government to go that direction. And in Europe, it's not over either yet. There are countries within the EU that are also critical about it. And I mentioned it already, there's some resistance in Germany as well, luckily not in the governmental parties, but in the other parties, especially on the far right. So there's a lot of work still to be done, and that the people understand. And that was what I briefly mentioned. It was not on the slide. We need a better communication strategy to explain it to the people. And this is one thing that we realized in Germany, that our public health system is not strong in communication. And that needs to be changed to strengthen or empower the people to understand what we're going for. Health empowerment is one of those keywords. So I would say now I really have to leave, because it's a little bit warm in Germany. So if I'm running with a suit, it's a little bit, I would get a little bit too warm. But thank you very much for the opportunity talking to you and in exchange. Maybe we could do this in the future. To be honest, this is my first lecture as a politician on this topic. So this was, for me, a very interesting experience. And thank you very much for your attention, and especially very smart questions. And I would say,
Muchísimas gracias.
Yeah.
Muchas gracias, Andrew, por el tiempo para nosotros.
Yeah. Adiós.
Adiós.
Yeah.
Adiós.
Seguimos, Ana, entonces.
Bien, perfecto. Juan, como viene siendo habitual, si te parece, podemos hacer la pausa ahora entre el primer segmento de la clase y la otra parte. Son las 11:10, ¿no? Hacemos hasta 11:20, 25, hacemos 15 minutos, hasta 11:25 y nos volvemos a conectar.
Perfecto. Le pedimos a Yasmín entonces que pongan o vos, Ana, en el chat, exacta la hora que volvemos.
Perfecto. Ahora lo... Listo,
Bueno.
Yasmín. Bien. Sí, y 26 ya en mi computadora, así que bueno, damos comienzo entonces ahora a la segunda parte de nuestra clase, que en realidad, como bien señalaba Juan al comienzo, toda la clase está enfocada en seguridad sanitaria mundial o global y multilateralismo, y vamos a seguir en esos temas con Annabelle. Ya la presenté a ella, así que sin mucho más que decir, le doy la palabra. Annabelle, todo tuyo, y bueno, ella va a ir dejando espacios para hacer preguntas, así que también cuestiones que les hayan quedado, que se les hayan ocurrido durante la pausa, preguntas, también vamos a tener el tiempo ahora en esta hora y media, tenemos más tiempo, así que vamos a tener el tiempo para ir charlando y conversando.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much, to the organizers of this course for having me here today. I'm very honored and humbled to be here with you. I just wanted to say that today I regret not having chosen Spanish as a second language in school, because I would have loved to be able to do this presentation in Spanish, but unfortunately I chose Italian. And now I'm based in Lisbon, so I'm learning Portuguese. So maybe, my next language on the list will be Spanish, hopefully. So next time I will be able to speak in Spanish. Just before I start, I want to make sure that my screen is shared properly. Can you just confirm that you can see my screen? Okay, so that is working. Before I dive into the topic, another note I wanted to make is that I would prefer for this presentation to be like a conversation. I apologize. So to make it dynamic and interactive with your help. So please feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have questions. I will also regularly stop to ask you if you have questions. And I included in this presentation specific moments of interaction, and you will need your phones to be able to answer the questions I have for you. So there will be a QR code that you can scan, and there will be very easy questions for you to answer just to get to know the topic and make it, again, more interactive. So you can see now on my screen the content of my presentation. So after Honorable Uman's amazing presentation, I will try not to repeat what he already explained, but I will focus on international forums in global health where parliamentarians can get involved. And I will also talk a bit more about the pandemic accord, because I feel that there are still a lot of questions in the room. So I will do my best to provide you with more information and also to try to answer any questions that you might have. So we are already starting with the first interactive moment. So I know that for interpretation purposes, I also put the instructions in Spanish on the screen. I apologize if there are any mistakes. I used Google Translate and Anna also helped me, but due to the timeline, it was a bit complicated to make sure that everything is correct. So I will ask you to use your phones and to scan this QR code you normally have now on your screen and to answer the question. Also, for time purposes, I would say 1 minute or 2 minutes for you to answer the question. I will not try to read in Spanish. I apologize. So I don't know if the interpreters want to do that for me. But yeah, I will give you a bit of time to reflect on that. I see there are already some answers coming in. I have 5 persons who voted. Seven. I will give a bit more time. I'm very happy because it's working. I have to admit I was a bit anxious. The technology might be more complicated, but I'm very happy it's working. Okay, 10 people. Okay, I think we can already start to see the results. Just a quick question, Anna, can you see the results on the screen already? Yes, okay. Well, as you can see, the majority of you have heard a bit about those topics, but there is no, in-depth knowledge of those topics. That's why we're doing these courses and these presentations, right? So I want to thank you all for answering this, this first quiz. There will be 2 others during the presentation, so please keep your phones close to you. Now, the next slide I want to show you is a scheme extracted from the World Economic Forum report on global risks from this year. And as we heard in the presentation from Dr. Ullman, the pandemic and future pandemics are still very high risks nowadays. And if you look at the list of short-term and longer-term risks that might appear, you will not see health in there, which is a bit surprising, right? I mean, I would say it's even worrying because we do not see health in there and it's not taken into account as a priority for global health and global leaders in general. So I just wanted to show you this to underline the idea that it's very important to also keep health topics in the conversation and to not forget that we just went through three years of a pandemic and that the impact reached every one of us. We all know people who were impacted by the pandemic via jobs being lost or people even losing their lives. So I would say, in my personal opinion, it's a bit worrying that we do not have health in this scheme. And what can parliamentarians actually do about this? So the connection here, in my opinion, is that parliamentarians can play an essential role in the global health topics. And one particular key role they can play is that they can hold governments accountable for the commitments they make on the international scene. Usually in international negotiations, governments are very, very skilled at making ambitious commitments and using very big words. But afterwards, it's important to make sure that these commitments are actually translated into concrete national policies. And in the case of health, it's even more relevant because we just went through a pandemic. And now we are talking about having a future international treaty that will prevent future pandemics from happening again. So parliamentarians can get involved and should get involved in this conversation to make sure that it will actually become a reality. Another thing parliamentarians can do is, obviously write laws that will transform these commitments into reality, but also advocate for bigger budgets. Because we all know that if there is no sustainable financing to strengthen the national health systems, the impact won't be there. And another point that was also mentioned before is the education and communication aspect of the parliamentarian with the constituencies. We have seen in many regions that parliamentarians are seen as a reliable source of information. And where there is this trust relationship, it's way easier to convince the constituencies that you need to wear a mask or you need to wash your hands or this kind of preventive measures to avoid outbreaks from becoming pandemics. Now, as Honorable Ullman already described, the World Health Assembly is actually the decision-making body of the World Health Organization. And one aspect that I want to explain to you what we did at Unite is that we had a campaign called Join Your Delegation, which was exactly meant for parliamentarians to get involved in their national delegations to join the World Health Assembly. And this was exactly in this idea that we need more parliamentarians involved in this conversation because it cannot be always heads of states and governments not speaking with other relevant stakeholders and then expecting the changes to happen. I'm just going to stop here for a few minutes to ask if there are already some questions at this point. If not, I can also continue. Yes, I can already see some hands being raised. Please, go ahead.
Muchísimas gracias, Annabelle. Buenísima la introducción. Te quería preguntar básicamente dos cosas. La primera con respecto, voy a empezar por la segunda. Pero, con respecto a la Asamblea Mundial de la Salud y al rol de los parlamentarios, yo no recuerdo bien si vos tenés la experiencia parlamentaria y me alegro que no esté en nuestro honorable legislador, es una forma, lo digo en forma jocosa, porque ¿no crees que un problema interesante para analizar es la relación entre el funcionamiento de los parlamentos nacionales y la exposición de los parlamentos nacionales y los parlamentarios a los asuntos globales? Pues yo creo que hay un problema bastante de asimetría entre la complejidad de los asuntos globales y cómo funcionan nuestros parlamentos nacionales. La verdad que es maravilloso todo lo que hacemos aquí y a mí siempre me llama la atención que lamentablemente muchos de nuestros parlamentos nacionales no están en condiciones de atender los asuntos globales porque tienen problemas básicos de funcionamiento, o sea, de disfuncionalidades en su forma ni siquiera de tener una cosmovisión básica. Entonces, esto parece una cuestión, digamos, operativa o de madurez de las instituciones o lo que fuera, pero simplemente quiero preguntarte a vos y a la experiencia de Unite, que ustedes de alguna manera, supongo, y está bueno que lo cuenten aquí, identifican, como dicen los americanos, champions, o como dicen también en general en la comunidad internacional, o sea, líderes identifican, pero que es un conjunto muy pequeño de los 46.000 parlamentarios nacionales que existen en el mundo, y el número no lo inventé, sino que efectivamente hay en el orden de unos 46.000, 47.000 parlamentarios. Y allí pusiste en la anterior placa, entre otras cosas, todas las funciones son importantes de los parlamentos nacionales, pero particularmente pusiste inclusive aquella vinculada a la representación, ¿no? Que es el tema de llevar los asuntos globales con sus constituencies, con los votantes, con las comunidades a las que representan. Entonces, un poco es una reflexión que quiero hacer que es un poco incómoda y antipática, que claro, es muy importante llevar la voz de esto, y por eso me pareció interesante tu consulta que nos hiciste, porque en la Argentina la cuestión del tratado pandémico o prepandémico, o acuerdo, como le llaman ahora, inclusive ha sido motivo de los diarios, ¿no? Hay notas periodísticas publicadas, y obviamente las comisiones de salud, uno podría imaginarse, e inclusive Relaciones Exteriores, que podrían tener algún conocimiento de esto. Entonces son todas cosas para investigar y para analizar de dónde estamos parados, ¿no? La comunidad parlamentaria nacional y los asuntos globales, y en particular la comunidad internacional de salud, que incluye la Asamblea y a la OMS. Simplemente, entonces, la pregunta es con respecto a eso, como la cuestión de lo básico, desde dónde esta cosa básica, que es quiénes son los actores centrales en la arena parlamentaria, que son los parlamentarios, cómo estamos respecto a eso, y ojo que aquí no es país pobre para ver país rico, no es solamente país pobre, país rico, para nada, en mi opinión. Y la segunda, también una sola consulta respecto a esto, como Tedros sigue siendo el secretario general de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, te quiero preguntar, porque fueron muy crítica en parte de la comunidad internacional con respecto a su rol, y adelanto mi opinión para que no parezca que pregunto esto porque soy uno de los críticos. Yo creo que tuvo un trabajo muy difícil, con unas competencias muy limitadas, y me impresionó, no lo conozco a Tedros, todos ya tenemos familiaridad con él, pero indirecta, pero creo que una cosa maravillosa que sí hizo es todos los días dar la cara e informar diariamente durante 2 años a la comunidad internacional acerca de cuál era el estado de la pandemia a nivel global. Lo hizo, para mí eso fue maravilloso, y además creo que sigue de alguna manera liderando, ha resistido todos esos embates, y bueno, están a la vista porque sigue siendo el secretario general de la organización. Así que sobre esas dos cosas te pregunto, y disculpen que un poco largas las preguntas. Gracias.
Well, thank you for these very interesting questions. I'll do my best to answer them quickly, but then we can also come back to it after the end of the presentation. I think that's a good way to balance the two. Regarding the first question of the capacity of national parliaments, there are some specific organizations like the International Parliamentary Union, IPU, that is meant to create conversations around more global topics. However, it is true that every national system is very different from each other. To give you an example, I used to be a parliamentary advisor at the Romanian parliament in Bucharest. And the reality I experienced there was very different from where I came from in France. And we are still talking about Europe. So we're talking about two countries inside the European Union that had two extremely different ways of functioning at the level of the administration. So to identify, leaders and competent persons who can be champions of global issues, there should be more support at the level of the parliament. So there could be, as we are pushing at Unite for global subcommittees for global health. So this is a strategy that we're trying to deploy in order to have those champions inside parliament for global health. I can only speak for global health now because that's what we are doing at Unite. But this is to give you an example of how we're also trying to raise the champions and also make them understand that their role is important inside of parliament to bring the global issues at the national level. And some parliaments have a more heavy bureaucratic work, so it might be more difficult to have support, technical support, to brief the parliamentarians on what is happening at the global stage. But this is why we have organizations like Unite, for instance. This is what we do. We are a network of parliamentarians who bring this knowledge to the parliamentarians to understand the stakes and to understand what they can actually do. Because we also realize that sometimes there is no knowledge and there is a gap. So this is how we can bridge the gap. We can also connect them with the experts who have the data, academia, renowned professors like Dr. Ullman, who can come and give presentations and explain the technicalities of the topics, but also make understand the power of their role. So I hope this answers part of the first question. And regarding the second question, if I understood it well, it was indeed a great communication effort from WHO to have Dr. Tedros's face communicating on the status of the evolution of the pandemic. And that also gave credibility to the organization, because before the pandemic, WHO did not have so much visibility, right? So the pandemic, in a way, made people aware that there are organizations and mechanisms in place, which are not perfect, obviously, but they do exist. And maybe there's a way of also improving them now that the spotlight is on them. So I will stop here, but please let me know if I didn't answer some part. We can get back to it maybe after the presentation. If there is any other question, I can take it now, or otherwise I would proceed, because I was describing the Join Your Delegation campaign. So maybe to move a bit forward, I can also direct you to our social media, because Unite did a really great job in promoting the Join Your Delegation campaign. And even after this presentation, I will leave you my email and my WhatsApp number, and you can always contact me for more questions that you wish me to detail, even in writing. So that's also a possibility.
Annabelle,
yes, please.
Solo interrumpo para decir que gracias a esa campaña que estuvo haciendo Unite en Latinoamérica, María José Plaza, asambleísta de Ecuador, fue invitada a participar de la delegación nacional. Entonces también a veces uno empieza a ver ahí resultados concretos, ¿no? A partir de una campaña y de un pedido, Unite colaboró respaldando en un pedido al Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores de Ecuador, y algo que no estaba pensado inicialmente, que era la presencia de la asambleísta María José Plaza en la delegación nacional del Ecuador. Finalmente su presencia fue aceptada, ella fue invitada. Después, bueno, hay toda una historia política de una crisis política en Ecuador, no nos vamos a meter en eso, pero sí ver que también de este tipo de campañas suceden, efectos concretos.
Yes, thank you, Anna, for this complement of information and very concrete example of what Join Your Delegation achieved. So to move forward, I'd like to talk a bit about what we call the United Nations high-level meetings, which are meetings that are convened by the UN General Assembly to discuss a specific topic of particular importance. So these are very interesting meetings because you have all of the heads of states and government who come together to discuss, a problem we are facing and what should we do about that. So in the past, you had specific topics discussed, such as universal health coverage, tuberculosis, Ebola, and so on. But what is particularly interesting this year is that we will have 3 high-level meetings. And these high-level meetings will be focused on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, which we call PPPR. The second one will be on universal health coverage, which we call UHC. And the third one will be on tuberculosis, which we call TB. Now, why am I mentioning these 3 high-level meetings? Well, these meetings are the opportunity to have a political declaration which will be negotiated by all of the member states of the UN and which will be adopted during the UN HLMs. And these political declarations are a written statement made by the member states who are concretely committing to take action to that specific problem. So for instance, this year we have the one on pandemic prevention, which was obviously an important topic this year, again, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there is still this political momentum to talk about this issue. And it's very interesting to see what member states will be negotiating and deciding on this. And I will be focusing a bit more on the one of pandemic prevention because it's a very unique process. As you know, there is also the pandemic accord being negotiated in Geneva. So you have 2 parallel international processes that are happening on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. One is the UNHLM in New York, which will happen in September. And on the other hand, you have the pandemic accord being negotiated in Geneva at this time. The one on universal health coverage, so there was already a UNHLM on that, both on UHC and on TB. And there will be another one this year. It's what we call a review. So member states are coming together again to make sure that the commitments they took in the past are actually being implemented. And if they are not, how do we bridge that gap and how do we make sure these are happening? And in this context, we had the organization of what we call the multi-stakeholder hearings. It might be a lot of new technical words, but I promise it will be very simple in the end. So the multi-stakeholder hearings were convened in May in New York, and they gathered very different relevant stakeholders to discuss these specific issues. So you had civil society organizations, you had academia, you had research parliamentarians who came together with some of the negotiators of the member states and who were able to express their opinions on what should be done, what hasn't been done, and what should be done to make sure that all of the commitments are taken and action is actually taken in these 3 fields. Again, here it's important to note that the one on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response is quite unique because we never had one international process happening in New York and at the same time an international treaty being negotiated in Geneva on the same topic. So I think you already guessed my next topic will be on the pandemic accord, but maybe I will do again here a quick stop to check if there are some questions, and if not, I will move forward.
Yo, si me permiten, solamente un comentario, Annabelle. La
Yes, please.
UNGA, la United Nations General Assembly del año 2016, por ejemplo, estuvo focalizada en el tema de drogas en el mundo, y junto a la Unión Interparlamentaria se organizó una importante, como una especie de reunión de parlamentarios previa con todas las autoridades de Naciones Unidas, ¿no? Y eso influyó, en mi opinión, y eso es lo importante, a los parlamentarios. Hubo una gran discusión porque venía todo el tema de legalización, un gran debate, inclusive el cannabis medicinal, etc. En el 2017 en la Argentina se aprobó una ley histórica de cannabis medicinal, muy difícil culturalmente para muchos legisladores entender que no era la legalización de la droga, sino algo. Entonces, lo que digo es muy importante la participación de los legisladores en estos debates. Si va a haber una declaración política de distintas enfermedades infecciosas o de la cobertura de salud universal, pero además del tema de la pandemia, estos temas deberían estar discutiéndose a nivel de un Parlamento Nacional, y aquellos elegidos para actuar en el ámbito global, parlamentarios, deberían estar participando. Bueno, pero lo que digo es que hay muchas trabas, esas cosas no ocurren en muchos países, pero sí tal vez han ocurrido. Una buena práctica en la Argentina fue esta con respecto al tema de drogas, ¿no? Así que simplemente quería decir qué maravilloso que todo esto, que es tan rico, bueno, los países y sobre todo la comunidad parlamentaria lo aproveche, ¿no? No es lo que está ocurriendo en muchos de nuestros países actualmente, pero tenemos la suerte de que está Unite allí a hacer este trabajo de concientización y de alguna manera un llamado a los parlamentarios a comprometerse más, ¿no? Quería simplemente decir eso. Gracias.
Mhm. Yes, thank you for that comment. Regarding the multi-stakeholder hearings, Unite engaged in those hearings, and we participated with a delegation of parliamentarians to the 3 hearings. And our president and founder, Ricardo Batista Leite, was a panelist during the pandemic prevention session. So he had this speaking role during that session, and I know he also called for more fellow members of parliament to get engaged in those fora, because it is the perfect spot to actually debate on those very rich issues, as you said. So thank you for that comment. Maybe now on the pandemic accord, I will ask you again to use your phones and to scan the QR code which you have here. And I will also ask you to make an exercise of imagination, as we say in French. I don't know if this expression works in English or in Spanish, but I will ask you to imagine you're a member of parliament and you are in session. And if you are presented with the text of the pandemic accord and you're asked to sign it and ratify it, what do you do? So if you could please scan the code and let me know your thoughts on this question. And again, I think we can give 1 minute for everyone to have time to scan the code and vote for the most interesting answer. Okay, we have 3 people who voted. Maybe I'll give just a few more seconds, and then we can discuss the results.
Qué duda grande, ¿no? Si están respondiendo en este juego de rol como si ustedes fueran parlamentarios o parlamentarias, o qué piensan que harían los parlamentarios o parlamentarias de sus países, ¿no? Esa también es una doble posibilidad. que harían ustedes si estuvieran en ese rol, o qué piensan que haría un parlamentario de ese país estando ahí.
Was that the question for me, Anna, or was that just a general observation?
Una pregunta general, pero eso, ¿desde dónde están respondiendo? ¿Cómo están respondiendo?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm leaving it open for interpretation, so stimulate a bit the creativity of the audience. Okay, so I think we have already a good amount of answers. So what I see on the screen is that the majority answered that you call your advisor to brief you last minute on the text. And poor advisor, if he has no idea what the pandemic accord is, I would be very uncomfortable in his position or her position. But that's why we are here, right? And that's why I'm holding this presentation on the pandemic accord. Also to tell you that from our own experience of our work at Unite, we had a lot of our members who had never heard about the pandemic accord, even recently. And our president asked during a session at the World Economic Forum, in an audience only composed of members of parliament, who was involved in negotiations, in talks with the governments to understand how they can get involved, how they can support the process. And none of the parliamentarians in the room raised their hands. And we are talking about an international treaty, right? So it's a bit, again, raises questions. But don't worry, after this presentation, normally you will know everything you need to be experts in the pandemic accord. So I will go a bit into the history of treaty making at the level of the World Health Organization. And we already saw in the previous presentation the existence of the international health regulations, which were adopted in 2005, sorry. And the other only treaty that already exists in international public health is what we call the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, shortly called the FCTC, which was adopted in 2003. So this specific international treaty was negotiated by member states to control the tobacco industry. So each member state who is part of the World Health Organization made a commitment to regulate at the national level the tobacco industry. And the first reference that was made to the pandemic accord was actually made by the Director General of the World Health Organization himself, Dr. Tedros, who invited to create this overarching framework in global health to strengthen global health security. And this came as we were already, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and there was also a need for concrete action because we had all witnessed that the international health regulations had not worked. Very few member states had actually followed the procedures that were already established by the IHR to make sure that we contain outbreaks from becoming pandemics. Now, when I first started working on this topic, I asked myself, well, if we already have the IHR, why do we need a new treaty on this topic? And there are several reasons. If you look at the scientific literature on this topic, there are several reasons that are being invoked for the necessity of having a pandemic accord. The first one is that the whole process of revising the international health regulations takes a lot of time, and we do not have that time. We need to be prepared today for the pandemics that will happen tomorrow, because as our president says, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. The second argument that is invoked is that this pandemic accord should be a complement to the already existing IHR without overlapping it, without contradicting it, but rather coming as a reinforcement of those already existing measures. And the third one is, as was already said before, the IHR was not, implemented. So there is no concrete compliance mechanism included into that. Now, to show you a visual representation of how the Pandemic Accord should be working in relation to the IHR, as you can see on the screen, the IHR is supposed to be incorporated in the general structure that will be created by the Pandemic Accord. And what is particularly interesting at the moment is that the negotiations are already on their way for the Pandemic Accord. And at the same time, you have this process of amending the IHR that is happening. But how do you make sure that these two processes are working together to make sure that the final text will not contradict itself? So for the negotiators in Geneva, it's a very difficult task. And they even told us that, this year for the health topics is going to be very difficult because of the UNHLMs that I mentioned before, and also because of the Pandemic Accord and the amendment process of the IHR. So how does it concretely happen? So in 2021, you had what we call an intergovernmental negotiating body, INB, that was established. And this bureau is comprised of representatives from Brazil, Egypt, Japan, and the countries you see on the screen. And their specific role is to draft and negotiate what we call the future Pandemic Accord. So on the screen, you can see the full name that is used in scientific literature. It's usually described as the WHO Convention, Agreement, or other international instrument, which is too long. So people usually refer to it as Pandemic Accord because it's easier and faster. Now at Unite, what happened is that during one of the first negotiations, we were selected as relevant stakeholders, which means that now we have access to some of the negotiations and we can actively contribute by providing written inputs or oral statements. And recently, we had an agreement with the INB to hold a specific meeting for parliamentarians. So this is something that will happen very soon. We will have a specific meeting dedicated for parliamentarians with the intergovernmental negotiating body so that parliamentarians can provide inputs and comments on the zero draft that is actually negotiated at the moment between member states. So for the members of parliament who are in the audience, this is also an invitation to join us and to be part of this conversation with the representatives of the INB. Now, just a quick legal aspect regarding the treaty. During the negotiations, there was this question on which article from the WHO Convention will we base the treaty? Because you have several articles that can create a legally binding instrument. So as you can see, it can be either a convention, a regulation, or recommendations. Now, the difference between them, and I will show you this scheme because I think it's a bit more concrete and easy to follow. The difference is the legal value of it, if you wish. So both conventions and agreements and regulations are legally binding, which means that if the member states agrees to it, it will have to enforce the obligations described in those. Whereas the recommendations, they are not legally binding. It's just an indication that you should be doing that, but there will be no concrete legal or political consequences if you don't. It will be more of a diplomatic impact. So what happened is that there was a whole session of negotiation around which article are we basing the future text on. And the decision was made to go with Article 19, which is the convention and agreement one. So that meant that the future text will be a full treaty, which will be legally binding, and it will have to be adopted by every member state. I know it might be a bit confusing. So again, if you have questions, please interrupt me. What I would like to underline here, maybe just a quick point of international law, is that when we say binding, it means that the member states have to legally enforce the commitments that are made. Whereas, as we saw with the recommendations, those are not binding, which means that you do not have legal obligation to commit to that. It's like a contract, if you wish. If as a personal individual, I sign a contract, I have to make that contract happen. If not, there will be no consequences, right? So as I was saying, the INB Bureau agreed to have a legally binding instrument based on Article 19, which means that we would have a full international treaty that will be negotiated and in the end adopted. Now you can see on the screen a bit of the timeline. So we already had 5 meetings of the INB. The last one was in April, and they presented a report of the results of the negotiations already at the World Health Assembly in May. You will have still other INBs, so as you can see, the negotiations are quite long and quite difficult, to have an adoption in May 2024 during the next World Health Assembly. It's a very short time to have an international treaty. To give you an idea, usually it takes 10 years to have an international treaty negotiated. This one is supposed to be adopted in less than 2 years. Also for political reasons, because in 2024 we have elections coming up. And for instance, if a country like the United States changes its administration back to an administration like we had with Donald Trump, they might not sign or ratify this kind of accord for the reasons we also, mentioned before. So I know there was a question in the first part about IP rights, and I can tell you from first experience that when I was following the negotiations, one of the most contentious issues was on IP rights and on sharing information, because there is a general tendency from the global north to be more protective of IP rights. But at the same time, there is this debate of not limiting innovation, but also sharing the information when you need to share it, as Dr. Ullman was also saying before. So some of the main lines that are included in the future text are to enhance global cooperation, to strengthen the national health systems. Equity is also a very important element in the future text. Obviously, investments in research and development will be a very important part of the future text. And as I was saying, the sharing of information, access to pathogens, or those issues are there, but it's not clear yet how the final agreement will be. Because as I was saying, it's one of the most contentious themes being negotiated at the moment. Just a quick note again on the role of parliaments. So, as we were saying before, some of the parliamentarians never heard about this international treaty being negotiated in Geneva. And what happens is that once all of the member states agree on a final version and it's adopted at the WHA in 2024, it will then be sent to all of the national parliaments who agreed in order for it to be ratified, which means that then there will be a cascade of national laws that will follow to actually implement those international obligations. So parliaments will have an important role in saying the final yes to that text, but they can also have this role, as I was saying at the beginning of the presentation, of holding governments accountable and make sure that the text actually becomes a reality. And as a conclusion, and then we can, of course, open the conversation, there have been a lot of debates around this text, from positions that are more sovereignist, who totally reject an international treaty on that, who reject WHO, to those who are very much in favor of that and who advocate for more collaboration and participation of everyone. I think this quote gives a good opening to conclude this topic, that obviously the international treaty will not fix all the problems that we are facing nowadays, but what it can do, and it's already happening, is that we are starting conversations and discussions around those topics. And the whole objective is also to limit the inequalities we have witnessed during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I would like to stop here first. I have another interactive moment, but we can do it after. I'd like to maybe see if I haven't lost anyone in the audience and if you're still all with me. So please, if you have any questions, I am listening.
Yo no quiero ser tan molesto. Hay alguien que quiera hacer una pregunta, pero tengo una pregunta para hacerte que le quería hacer también a Edgar, al honorable diputado. Pero está Edgar aquí, Jiménez, adelante.
Okay, mi pregunta es si en el proceso, antes de la presentación a los parlamentos, como estrategia, ¿se tiene pensado alguna discusión que incluya a los parlamentos y no solamente a los delegados del Poder Ejecutivo, ¿verdad? En las instancias correspondientes?
Just to make sure I understand the question correctly, you are referring to a conversation inside the national parliament. Is that correct?
Así es, dentro de los parlamentos regionales, nacionales o alguna estrategia para discutirlo regionalmente en las regiones de la OMS.
Okay, I think I understand the question. Thank you for the question. I think it comes in the end to the question, is it a political priority for the country? Are parliaments willing to discuss this? Is it something that members of parliament are willing to raise as an issue and put it on the table to discuss? Because what we have seen is that, first of all, there's not much awareness on that. And there have been several calls that were made from, to WHO actually, to target their communication strategy, to raise awareness on this topic, to start a debate. It could be indeed an interesting strategy to start the conversation inside the parliament. But usually what happens is that if you have a national crisis or other political priorities, these global level topics, they will not be a priority inside the national parliament. So it makes it quite difficult to have this conversation. We've been also thinking about organizing, for instance, a specific group of parliamentarians that could discuss with the Ministry of Health, involving academia and civil society to create this whole of society approach. But what we've seen in some countries is that the government is not willing to open this conversation so that they can keep a control on the negotiations. I don't know if that makes sense, but what I'm trying to say is that there are not many openings to talk about this topic. So it would be wonderful if we were talking about this in national parliaments, but for now, as it is going, it might only happen when the text will actually be tabled in the national parliament. I hope this answers your question.
Yo me sumo a Annabelle para transmitirle a Edgar, porque nosotros tenemos una diplomatura internacional en diplomacia parlamentaria que tiene 120 horas, ¿no? Y que tiene una primera parte conceptual, otra parte de diplomacia parlamentaria en acción, y una tercera son los desafíos de la diplomacia parlamentaria, incluye estos temas de fondo, como por ejemplo salud global. De allí viene la idea de hacer este curso especializado. Y lo que vemos siempre es que la diplomacia parlamentaria es de carácter multinivel. Es decir, tenemos desde los niveles nacionales, el nivel regional e inclusive subregional. Entonces, por ejemplo, nosotros tenemos aquí Parlatino a nivel de América Latina, y luego tenemos, por ejemplo, el Parlasur, para los que somos de los países miembros del Mercosur, y bueno, está el Parlamento Andino, el Parlamento Centroamericano, según la región. Y a la vez están los, obviamente, internacionales, como la Unión Interparlamentaria que estamos hablando. E inclusive se puede hablar a nivel subnacional, también las legislaturas provinciales, las entidades representativas que nosotros les llamamos aquí consejos deliberantes, siempre es importante y es parte de la democracia. Pero bueno, la realidad es que depende lo sofisticado y de la calidad de cada democracia y de sus parlamentarios, que está directamente vinculado. Así que solamente lo único que le digo a Edgar, y esto es para todos, esto es una opinión personal, conociendo mucho el tema, que la responsabilidad es mutua. La responsabilidad es de los parlamentos y de los parlamentarios, la responsabilidad en cumplir con sus obligaciones, porque además son competencias que están en la Constitución, etcétera, vinculadas a política exterior puntualmente y vinculadas a temas de salud, a legislar, controlar, aprobar presupuestos, etcétera. Pero además es una responsabilidad de los ejecutivos. El gran problema de los poderes, de los gobiernos, de la rama ejecutiva, es que muchos suelen tratar de ignorar a los parlamentos o inclusive combatir a aquellos que quieren tener roles de liderazgo en asuntos globales. Y lo mejor que podría ocurrir a un país sano institucionalmente es que no solo el Parlamento, sino que exista una política desde los ejecutivos hacia el Parlamento en asuntos globales. Nada mejor para un país que el gobierno de turno trabaje en forma articulada con el Parlamento, donde están las voces de oficialismo de turno y de la oposición, porque eso permite facilitar no solo la riqueza en el debate, la fuerza de las negociaciones, sino además cuando van después los tratados, los acuerdos internacionales, tratados particularmente, a ser ratificados. Entonces, de alguna manera facilita la ratificación. Así que quería decirle eso simplemente a Edgar y sumarle a Annabelle. Es un tema súper complejo que tiene unos desafíos enormes, pero bueno, para eso estamos aquí con este tema. Ahí está María Fernanda Fernández, adelante, por favor.
Fernanda, ¿estás ahí para hacer la pregunta?
No te escuchamos, Fernanda.
Si está complicado el tema del audio, si querés podés escribir la pregunta mientras tomamos quizás alguna otra pregunta y la vemos en el chat y yo la leo en voz alta.
Mientras escribe María Fernanda, esto es una pregunta para vos, Annabelle, que me parece importante. Mirá, este libro que lo debes conocer, yo justo apenas sale en Estados Unidos, que es el de How to Prevent the Next Pandemic, cómo prevenir la próxima pandemia, de Bill Gates, del que no se habla absolutamente nada, pero que fue una tarea de divulgación muy importante que hizo Bill Gates a nivel global, ha sido traducido prácticamente a todos los idiomas del mundo y lo ha leído muchísima gente. Yo lo leí apenas salió, y él pone como ejemplo de por qué es importante tener un sistema global para prevenir pandemias, y pone como algo que a mí me hizo sonreír. Hay muchos ejemplos, pero dijo el tema de los bomberos. Entonces dice, ¿por qué existen los bomberos? Porque se incendia una casa, y cuando ya las urbes empezaron a crecer, la casa que se incendia, si uno lo deja al libre albedrío del propietario de la casa, o el inquilino, quien vive así, se prende a fuego la casa del vecino, y la otra, y la otra, y la otra, y se prende fuego toda una ciudad, si alguien no lo para. Entonces, mancomunadamente, todos se ponen de acuerdo para tener un servicio para parar y que no se generen grandes incendios que afectan a todos. Ese ejemplo pone Bill Gates para decir, necesitamos una estructura y una logística y una arquitectura para prevenir pandemias y para rápidamente detectarlas y atacarlas, ¿no? Ese es el ejemplo. Y yo, que vengo en parte de mi vida profesional del sector de la industria aeronáutica, que siempre me gustó mucho, porque los aviones despegan y luego tienen que aterrizar en algún lado. Las regulaciones son brutales. Está la organización, la OASI, que son las regulaciones, está la industria, IATA, las aerolíneas, y están inclusive hasta los aeropuertos que tienen Airports Council International, su propia, están todos los actores. Ahora, si alguien sale de un país y quiere ir a otro, no puede aterrizar si no cumple con tener una pista, tener un aeropuerto y todo, pues, obviamente. Bueno, esto es, y aquí viene la pregunta. Yo creo que también en este tipo de acuerdos es importante establecer ciertas restricciones, ciertas obligaciones de los estados, por ejemplo, en materia de registración y de estadísticas, ¿no? Entonces te pregunto si eso, ¿cómo ves vos el tema de aprovechar para establecer? Porque no alcanza con que un país, por ejemplo, tenga un bajo nivel de desarrollo, en absoluto, no alcanza con eso, porque también es importante, puede ser un país que tenga bajo nivel de desarrollo y, por ejemplo, tenga altos niveles de pobreza, etcétera, para enfrentar con mayor fuerza una pandemia, por ejemplo, pero estar bajo un gobierno autocrático, en manos de un dictador, sin derechos para la gente, donde se falsean, las instituciones no funcionan, etcétera. Entonces, yo creo que también es una gran oportunidad siempre, y aquí también en materia de cómo luchar contra un desafío global como las pandemias, que el acuerdo establezca ciertas obligaciones para poder beneficiarse sobre todo, porque estos acuerdos tienden a generar una equidad y un beneficio sobre todo para aquellos que menos tienen, porque el acuerdo es para todos, porque va a proteger que no vaya una persona de un lado a otro y se transmita y se convierta en una pandemia la enfermedad transmisible, pero también se ponen, porque negocian los países que necesitan, un montón de condiciones que tienen que ver con mercados donde inclusive hay inversión privada, en desarrollo, en investigación, etc. Entonces, para lograr justicia, sí, pero además la justicia, también condiciones de mejora u obligar de alguna manera a aquellos que no hacen las cosas bien en hacerlas mejor. Entonces, esa es la pregunta un poco, ¿no? ¿Qué condiciones? Entre ellas, por ejemplo, el tema de las estadísticas, lo que ocurrió, por ejemplo, en muchos países con respecto a los testeos, ¿no? Donde muchos países no hicieron testeos, es una cuestión hacia dentro de los países, pero también es hacia afuera. Entonces, esa es la pregunta que te hago, no sé si se entiende. Gracias.
No, thank you for the question. I think it's a difficult one because, as I was saying during the negotiation processes, there's obviously this will to strengthen national health system and create global cooperation. And global cooperation is also created by exchange of data and sharing of information. Now, everyone agrees on the big principle in theory, but then in practice, as I was saying, every member state needs to agree to actually, share accurate data and make sure that, the obligations and restrictions are signed. It's definitely something that member states want to do. But what I've been seeing in the negotiations is that sometimes the strong language on those topics is being diminished so that the compromise and the adherence is bigger. So that means that probably the words will be quite vague, and then it will be the responsibility of the national state to try to, comply to the words of the treaty as much as possible. So as the negotiations are still ongoing, it's hard to say what the final result will be. What I'm trying to say is that in principle, yes, there is this will to have accurate data, exchange of information, and make sure that everyone has access to vaccines, for instance, or to treatments. As I was saying, the equity principle is very strong as a concept and in words in the treaty, also to balance the inequalities that were witnessed between global North and global South. And it will be a question of how far the negotiators take the agreement, because this process needs to be adopted by all of the countries, otherwise you won't have a global cooperation, right? So it's a very difficult topic because you need to have agreement of everyone, but at the same time, everyone still has to have this freedom of implementing as they can, also according to their local capacities. And that's why one of the aspects in the treaty is to strengthen local capacity. So to have more, for instance, local factories of production of vaccines, so that we don't have the same dynamic repeated that we witnessed during COVID, that some countries monopolize all of the vaccines and some of them do not have access to vaccines. So there is this idea of creating capacity at the local and national levels, and that goes also hand in hand with financing. That's why also the question of money and sustainable financing is also another difficult topic of negotiation, because who is going to finance all of those infrastructures that are needed to guarantee that everyone has access to vaccines? Where will that money come from? How will the government make sure that enough money or enough finances are invested in everything that needs to be there, so that they can actually provide accurate data, exchange accurate data, inform others if there is an outbreak happening, have the vaccines and so on. So I think it is it's a difficult topic, but this whole treaty is a difficult text to be negotiated, because, to give you an example, there's still no agreement on the definition of a pandemic. So still at this stage, member states have not agreed what a pandemic is, because we know that usually there's this definition of outbreak when it happens at the local level, epidemic when it crosses one border, and pandemic when it's already in several borders. But up until now, from what I've known and what I've read, there is no agreement on what the pandemic is. So it's very hard to answer those questions, knowing that some very basic definitions are not included at the moment in the draft of the text. So I hope this touched on some of the elements of your question.
Bien. Si no hay una repregunta, acá tengo la pregunta de María Fernanda, que estaba con problemas de sonido, que señala, un poco más pensando a nivel local o pensando las diferentes realidades en Latinoamérica. María Fernanda dice: un país que adhiere a un tratado internacional, pero ¿qué pasa cuando la salud no es algo que la nación delega a las provincias? No es una facultad delegada a las provincias por parte de la nación. ¿Dónde está la responsabilidad de hacer cumplir lo relativo al tratado? ¿El Parlamento Nacional o los provinciales? ¿Quién tiene que hacer cumplir si se ratificara este acuerdo de las pandemias? Y esto creo que se conecta a un comentario personal acá, con algo que con Annabelle conversamos mucho en Unite, y es algo que a mí siempre es como una pregunta que siempre tengo dando vueltas, que es cómo hacemos el tema del law enforcement en tratados de este tipo, ¿no? Cómo hacemos cumplir la ley en lo relativo a este tipo de tratados, cómo se da realmente, qué pasa si el país no cumple, si hay punitivo, no solo dentro del país, sino a nivel mundial. Así que Annabelle está cansada de escuchar este tipo de preguntas de parte mía, probablemente.
No. I'm never tired of you, Anna, asking this question, because I know it has been something we have discussed together quite several times. I think it depends on how the administrative system is structured in every country. So for instance, in a non-federal government, let's take for instance France, or general countries in the European Union, there the responsibility is clearly on the national parliament. It gets more complicated indeed for federal systems, because what we have seen with Anna, we were working on a case study on universal health coverage in Argentina, and she was explaining to me that the responsibility is at the province level. So if the responsibility for health decisions is at the province level, I think I am not an expert in constitutional law in Latin America, but maybe Juan de Dios can help us in this perspective. But I think that the decision will probably be discussed at the national parliament and then maybe delegated at the province level. This is only my intuition, so I'm not sure if I'm right or wrong, but the decision will have to be taken somewhere. So if the structure is at the decision-making is at the province level, then probably the province will need to come together with the other provinces to make sure that there is an uniform translation of the agreements. But again, I am not sure about this aspect, as I'm not an expert in constitutional law in Latin America.
Bueno, voy a dar, si te parece, Annabelle, una respuesta bastante simple, y esto aplica obviamente a las tres ramas de gobierno, al Poder Ejecutivo, al Poder Legislativo y al Poder Judicial inclusive. Argentina es efectivamente un país federal, pero hay que distinguir entre una cuestión que sea interprovincial y una cuestión que sea intraprovincial. Cuando afecta a más de una provincia, y el caso de la pandemia es perfecto, es federal la cuestión. No importa si es de salud, o si estamos hablando de delitos, o estamos hablando de cualquier otro aspecto. Si la cuestión afecta a más de una provincia, inmediatamente se activa porque, digamos, no queda dentro del ámbito provincial la cuestión. Así que la pandemia, ustedes ya han visto que tanto el Ejecutivo con sus DNU o el Poder Legislativo, por ejemplo, cuando legisló con motivo de la pandemia en materia de educación, porque estaba prohibida la educación telemática a distancia en la Ley General de Educación, y hubo que modificarla y poner que en casos de pandemia se podrá, bueno, y tantas otras cosas. Ocurre porque la pandemia afecta a todo el territorio nacional, por ende es una cuestión federal y requiere de legislación nacional, y los temas se discuten como pasó con la Corte Suprema, cuando se discutió el tema de la pandemia asociado a la educación. También fue un tema que debió resolver la Corte entre la ciudad y la provincia y el Estado Nacional. Así que esa es la respuesta más simple.
Well, thank you so much we have our answer there. So thank you so much for helping us with this question.
¿Alguien más con preguntas aquí sobre la clase o comentarios de realidades nacionales de cada país?
Everyone needs a coffee at this time. I think it's time to have a coffee break.
¿Hay un ejercicio pendiente o no? ¿Sí vamos a hacer un ejercicio pendiente antes de terminar?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes, and then we can maybe conclude the presentation if there are no more questions, obviously. So again, this last interactive moment would be to ask you what you are doing now that you have heard all of this presentation. I'll give you again a few minutes for you to respond to the quiz. I think, yeah, you need to put your name and then join. This one is a bit different. And normally now, yeah, you have the question on the screen. And this one is with a timer, so you only have 1 minute to answer. $20 seconds left. Okay, so I think now we have a percentage of the information coming on the screen. So obviously this was just, again, for you to get creative. All of the answers are correct. This is for you to let us know if there are any specific strategies you're thinking about of getting involved. If you have any comments or questions about our work at Unite, obviously I am extending this invitation to join us in this work of involving parliamentarians in global health topics. And as the last answer is saying, we might need a coffee first before taking any decision. So you have time to reflect on these topics we covered today. And as I was saying, I'll leave you my contact in case you have in the future any questions. You can always reach me, and you can always reach also Anna. She can make the link between us. And yes, I think that's it on my side. I leave you some sources on the PowerPoint, which I believe we will also share with you. Some reports and some interesting documentation that were used to do this presentation. And some of them are particularly interesting. So I would encourage you to have a very quick look at all of these resources. And yeah, thank you for your attention and for your participation. I was very happy to be with you here today. So thank you for having me.
Excelente clase, ¿eh? Muy bueno, Annabelle, felicitaciones.
Thank you so much. It's the first time I'm doing a class with my students being maybe 8 kilometers away. So that was a challenge, but I'm happy that technology was on my side today. So thank you.
Buenísimo. Yo como no creo que, si vamos a tomar un café ya termina la clase, así que simplemente hago un comentario antes de que termine, Annabelle. Quería decirte a vos y a todos, fundar mi voto, porque aproveché para votar. Yo elegí de esas 3 opciones, que son todas válidas, elegí la de sumarse a Unite. ¿Y por qué? Está basado en mi experiencia con este tema. La Unión Interparlamentaria, que es, digamos, la única de escala, ¿no? Organización Parlamentaria Internacional que trata estos temas, tiene la posibilidad de tener observadores. Y, por ejemplo, Unite es de las pocas organizaciones que, creada en el 2017, consolidada rápidamente después de la pandemia, logró que votara la Asamblea y hoy es un observador dentro de la Unión Interparlamentaria, con lo cual interactúa, y de hecho en la última asamblea estuvo Ricardo Baptista Leite con su equipo, fue en Manama, en Bahrein, en Medio Oriente, y estuvieron haciendo inclusive reuniones específicas vinculadas a temas de salud. Así que, ¿por qué digo esto? Porque lo dije en la clase anterior, las redes de parlamentarios, que son de carácter voluntario, no participan institucionalmente los parlamentos, es decir, por ejemplo, Unite. En Unite hoy hay unos parlamentarios argentinos que participan, no le tienen que pedir permiso a nadie, no le tienen que pedir permiso a los presidentes de turno, ni siquiera le tienen que pedir permiso a su partido político o a su bloque, o sea, es libre, estas redes son libres, y eso es muy importante porque los que están ahí están en forma genuina, es porque tienen interés, no por otra cosa. Obviamente no representan al Parlamento, se representan a sí mismos, y bueno, y es muy, muy valioso. Si estas organizaciones como Unite, que ya están organizadas con los expertos, con todo el activo de las relaciones con la Organización Mundial de Salud, las organizaciones regionales a través de sus capítulos regionales, la comunidad científica, la comunidad inclusive de farmacéutica, etcétera, de compañías, etcétera. Entonces me parece que eso es muy valioso, y entonces, sea el caso de salud o sea cualquier otro campo, las redes tienen ese rol que a veces no se ve tan importante, que facilitan muy rápido a un parlamentario que quiere colaborar, si quiere ayudar a su país o a sus votantes, es la forma más fácil de hacerlo. Desde allí, obvio, las redes no pueden hacer todo. Las redes tienen que también apalancarse y estar vinculadas a las grandes organizaciones, como por ejemplo la Organización Mundial de Salud, a nivel de gobiernos, o inclusive la Unión Interparlamentaria, que lo ha hecho muy bien Unite. Y quiero contar simplemente que cuando Argentina organizó el G20, a través de la creación de un espacio que se llama P20, que es el espacio de presidentes de parlamentos de países del G20, más la Unión Europea, por eso es G20, son 19 países, más la Unión Europea, nosotros convocamos a la Red Parlamentaria Global de OCDE, a OCDE en realidad, que es una institución muy poderosa que participa en todas las reuniones G20, y por ejemplo la UIP se negó a darle el estatus de observador a la OCDE. Ahora se lo está dando y empezaron a hacer cosas en común. Hay un nuevo secretario general de la OCDE, bueno, hay también un nuevo presidente, en esa época había una mexicana, y ahora hay un portugués que igual finaliza ahora su gestión de presidente de la UIP, pero lo que digo es, lo que ha logrado Unite, y créanme que es muy valioso, así que en materia de salud global tenemos la suerte de que está Unite, y yo le recomendaría, y de hecho lo hago a los parlamentarios y parlamentarias de nuestros países, que se unan a Unite, y tenemos la suerte, esto para Argentina, que la coordinadora justamente es una argentina de América Latina, ¿no? Y aquí está Ana Kushnir, que también representa la región de América Latina y el Caribe. Así que quería decir simplemente eso, una forma de fundar mi voto, que dije, yo lo primero que haría es decirle a los colegas, vamos a Unite.
Gracias, Juan. Sí, en Argentina, pero con los ojos puestos en Latinoamérica, y ya con amigos hacia el sur del Río Grande por todos lados, así que ya no más Argentina casi. Bueno, si no hay más preguntas, comentarios para Annabelle, espero que se hayan ido, por mi parte espero que se hayan ido de esta clase con algo más de idea de por dónde va el acuerdo de las pandemias, y esta idea de cómo trabajar en pos de la seguridad sanitaria global. Era un poco, sabemos que es una clase, que son 3 horas, que es mucho tiempo, y a la vez son temas muy grandes, pero nuestra idea, como en todo el curso, es poder tener un primer acercamiento a estos temas de salud global y dejarles en cada PowerPoint bibliografía para que puedan también, a quien le interese tal o cual tema, seguir profundizando en el estudio de estas cuestiones. Cerramos por hoy, Juan.
Cerramos entonces. Muchísimas gracias, Annabelle, felicitaciones, excelente.
Muchas gracias, Annabelle, excelente, sí.